And welcome to our Bible study, What Makes Lutherans Lutheran? We're in part 11. It doesn't seem like we have covered that much material, but indeed we have. Let's take a quick review of what we covered in our last episode. In our last episode, we looked at the Orthodox view of man receives the doctrine of Christ. It's not a true gift from God. It is something that man accepts for his salvation. And this is what differentiates the Orthodox view from the Lutheran. Lutheran belief is that God does everything and gives the gift to man by, without deserving it, without earning it. It is given a free gift to man. And man can't even accept that. That acceptance is through faith, which is a gift of the Holy Spirit. The Reformed view takes a look is that Christ died for only the elect. Those that were destined to be saved before the foundations of the world. Now, should an infant die before they reach the age of accountability, those elect infants are regenerated by Christ. The Roman Catholics believe that the grace of God assists man in his justification when man assents to God's grace. Here, man is involved in his salvation, whereas the Lutheran view, man is not. He is totally divorced from it. It is given as a gift. The Baptist view, man accepts God's grace. And the liberal view is that, and by the liberal church, I am talking about the Elka branch of Lutheranism, the Anglicans, and some of the others that have strayed from the Orthodox belief. And they look at it as, what does man need to be saved from? And how does Jesus relate to that? It is something, it's a novel view. It's something that has cropped up in the last 100 years and has gained some popularity because they have felt that Christianity, mainline Christianity, is too judgmental. If we take a look at the various church bodies and what it means to be saved and how does original sin play into it, what is the purpose of the moral law, and what is the gospel's purpose? Let's take a look at each of these rows here, and we see that the Eastern Orthodox see that the soul is stained by original sin, and the will to cooperate with grace. Now notice here that will of man is able to cooperate, where we'll see the Lutherans have a slightly different bent. Now the law is there to show what God's will for our life is. And they would say that God's will is for us to lead a sinless life. The gospel provides the empowering grace, the yielding obedience, and ultimately salvation depends on the Christian's obedience. Notice that the Christian is involved in their salvation. The Lutheran view, the soul is thoroughly corrupt and will turn completely against God. And that, if you take a look at the Genesis account of Adam and Eve, is certainly true. We like to place ourselves on God's throne and literally take him off the throne and set him aside. And Let us do it. We know better. We know what we're doing. Um, the law's purpose is to point out our sin. It also restrains us from doing evil, and it shows what God's will for our life is. Um, Now, the gospel provides the forgiving grace through word and sacrament. The law points out where we fall short of the glory of God. The gospel tells us that even though we are thoroughly and totally corrupt, God sent his son as the ultimate sacrifice who took on the sin of the world and paid the blood price. And we received salvation through his blood, through his efforts, not through our own merit or our own deserving of that. The Reformed and Presbyterians, they also believe that we have a thoroughly corrupt soul and we will turn completely against God. They too believe that our sin, or the law will point out our sin and will show God's will for our lives. They also believe that, like Lutherans, gospel will provide forgiving grace symbolized by the word and sacrament. And there's the big difference. For the Reformed and Presbyterian, it is the symbol of by the word and sacrament, whereas the Lutheran, it is salvation through word and sacrament. And for salvation, for the Reformed and Presbyterian, it's never sure, it's only given to the elect whom God has pre-chosen. And how do you know you're pre-chosen? You have to wait until judgment to find out. The Roman Catholics, a corrupted soul, but man has a will to cooperate with grace. The law's purpose is to show God's will for our lives. And the gospel's purpose is to provide empowering grace and yielding obedience. Notice that again, man is doing something, man is involved. And, the Christian salvation and the Roman Catholic view of things ultimately depends on how well the Christian obeys the moral law. And that leads a conundrum. That leaves the Roman Catholic wondering, have I done enough? Am I too evil? Am I too sinful to get into heaven? And this is going to probably get me into a bit of trouble. If you took the most vile character in history, and I think we could all agree Adolf Hitler is probably up there, if not at the top. If he truly repented and asked God to forgive him, God's grace is sufficient to cover all of his sin. And if he did this, could be in heaven. That causes a huge problem with a lot of people because they see him as unable to repent, but it is God's grace that abounds. God doesn't look at our sin and grade it and say that if I commit sin X, that's not as bad as somebody else who's committing sin Y. And so we see that they have a gradation of sins. Lutherans look at the Bible and they take God at his word, and that all sin is an abomination to God. Now, true that the Bible does point out certain sins and it uses the word abomination or some other adjective, but in God's view, sin is sin. There's no little sin and there's no huge sin. It's all sin. Now, the Baptists believe that the soul is thoroughly corrupt and greatly impaired because of that corruption. The law shows God's will for our lives, and the gospel provides grace so that the will chooses salvation. See, man has a role to play. He gets to choose salvation. And ultimately, that salvation depends on the Christian's decision. The last couple that we have is the Methodist or Wesleyan. They agree that we have a thoroughly corrupt soul and our will is greatly impaired. They believe very much like the Baptist. They also believe, like the Baptist, that the law shows God's will for our life. They're also, like the Baptist, the gospel provides grace that allows the will to choose salvation. And again, they also believe that it ultimately depends on the Christian's decision for salvation. Now, here is where things go off from the Orthodox. The liberal church is that sin is primarily a psychological experience, and that the law's purpose is man-made for a life in community. This was a set of laws or rules that people knew how to live in a tribe or in an extended family. And that the gospel's purpose is to show us the life that Jesus led, and that we should model his life, our lives after his. And that salvation pertains only to the betterment of this life. It doesn't leave you very satisfied. It doesn't leave, that leaves too much in the air for what does this mean for me? And it also, a number of these do not answer the age-old question, is that if these rules, as the liberal church believes, that are for living in an extended family or a tribe, why are they virtually universal? If you go around the world and you go to India, it's abhorrent to their culture to murder someone. If you go to outer Mongolia, for example, it's abhorrent to that culture for murder to occur. The American Indian, to murder someone in your own tribe was abhorrent to them. Murdering someone outside the tribe was a different set of rules. But throughout the world, you have these things that within my tribe, yes, or within my nation group, in my culture, it's a bad thing to kill people, to murder people. It's a bad thing to steal. It's a bad thing to do, to not respect authority, and et cetera, et cetera. And so that the liberal view doesn't answer why this is such a universal thing. They take a look at it in a much narrower view than we do. We look at it is that God impressed this law on man's heart. Children, very young children, know that it's not right to hit. And, you take a look at that, and how did they come to that knowledge? They know that, going against what mom and dad tells you does have consequences. And they seem to know implicitly that it is wrong to do these things. And that's one thing that gives us pause. We can take a look at it, and realize that our God cared enough about us is that he gave us a built-in moral compass to guide us in our life. Okay, there are there's a concept of progressive salvation or sanctification. And that is where he effectively makes us, the process in which God makes us men who are sinful holy is a progressive. The Lutheran Church, we teach that sanctification may vary at different times in a person's life. And I've put up a couple of Bible verses that you can take a look at to go into more detail. But there may be at times in my life where I am leading a more sanctified life than at others. I know in my life that's certainly true. I like to think over the last 20 or 30 years that I have led a more sanctified life than I did in the first 30 some years of my life. We also, along with evangelicals and Presbyterians, teach that a perfect salvation in this life due to the devil and his work and our sinful flesh is impossible. For perfection, perfect sanctification, we have to wait until after our death, and that we are in the presence of the Lord when we obtain that perfect sanctification, that perfect life. Now, some of the other church bodies, specifically the Roman Catholics and the Eastern Church, say that perfect sanctification is difficult to obtain in this life, but it can be done. And they point to the saints as being objects of this. And we take a look at that, and we take a look at some of the people they have sainted, and you wonder, at least I do, did they live that perfectly sanctified life or not? Others, Methodist and the Pentecostals, for example, will say that perfect sanctification is attainable in this life if you work hard enough, if you work and earnestly seek it. The requirements for sanctification that the Roman Catholic Church insists, and it mandates that perfect sanctification is required before enjoying the perfect vision of God. And saints, due to their achievement of this perfect holiness, enter immediately into heaven. The rest of us who haven't achieved full sanctification are purged of this in a place called purgatory for their sins, and they're there for an indeterminate period of time. That's why Luther got so mad at the Catholic Church back in the 1500s. They were selling these indulgences that for a mere, name your price, you could purchase time off for your relative or for yourself to not have to spend so much time in purgatory. And once they had completed this purging in purgatory, they could then enter the presence of God. With the Lutheran, assuming that you have not, that you have remained in the faith, then you're good to go. As soon as you die, you are in God's presence. And that's the end of our lesson for today. Again, if you would like to receive a copy of the outline of a upcoming lesson or past lessons, feel free to send me a DM on either of our Facebook pages. St. John Lutheran Church of North Long Beach, and Peace Lutheran Church of Pico Rivera. Until next time, where we again will look at what makes Lutherans different from other Christian denominations, I pray God's peace to you, and I hope that he blesses your study. Thank you for joining us today.